Hey everybody, welcome back to Dispatch Revolution, where we go deep with the people who are pushing the movement, doing the work, and building community. We have another special episode for you. Today's guest just announced that they are running for the United States Senate.
I'm Zach Wahls. I'm a sixth-generation Iowan and a new generation of Democrat.
Zach Wahls is a dear friend of mine, going back to our time together at the University of Iowa. His political career really began with an incredible act of courage, the kind of courage that is needed in this moment.
We're Iowans. We don't expect anyone to solve our problems for us. We'll fight our own battles. We just hope for equal and fair treatment from our government.
In 2011, Zach gave a speech at the Iowa State Capitol defending marriage equality, just as Republicans were attempting to amend the state constitution to ban it.
It's a personal issue for me. I have two moms, my tall mom, Terry, my short mom, Jackie. They got married in 2009.
The sense of family comes from the commitment we make to each other, to work through the hard times so we can enjoy the good ones. It comes from the love that binds us. That's what makes a family.
This speech went viral.
Turned my life totally upside down. I had this decision to make whether I was going to go back to my studies as a civil and environmental engineering student, or whether I would kind of take up this mantle to be an advocate for families like mine, both across Iowa and ultimately across the country.
And luckily, he would. Zach would go on to co-found Scouts for Equality.
I still live by those scouting values. Most important to me is that a scout is brave.
Your viewers will be able to see my Eagle Scout certificate hanging over my shoulder here in my office. Scouting was a very important part of my life and upbringing, and scouting had, for 35 years, had an official policy of banning gay youth and adults from participating in the organization.
That national campaign would go on to victory, helping to change the landscape for LGBTQ plus families and youth across the country. He'd eventually mount a run for state senate while finishing his graduate degree in public policy at Princeton University.
And in fact, the primary was the same day as graduation day for my program. So the joke that I told 100 times on the stump, I won't be able to walk, but I am able to run.
And now he's taking the next step in his career, running for the United States Senate. Dispatch Revolution sits down with Zach Wahls.
Every voter out there is either a friend or a future friend. And that is the ethos that we need to bring to this work.
All right. I am honored and privileged to have with us today Iowa State Senator Zach Wahls, a person I consider a friend and someone I really, really look up to, and have just had a wonderful view of seeing his career blossom and develop. So, Zach, thank you so much for joining us here on Dispatch Revolution Podcast.
Stacey, I feel very much the same way about you, and it's great to be here.
Thank you so much. You just wrapped up session. And for folks who don't know, Zach is not just a state senator, but spent some time as the leader of the Democrats in the Iowa Senate. So you've had a unique view and insight into how legislative politics play out in the state. Talk to me a little bit about your assessment of this last legislative session, sort of the state of Iowa. How are we doing as a state, and what do we need to do to be prosperous in the future?
I think one of the most important things that I learned is about really the importance of leadership. And if I had to pick a single moment for Iowa Democrats where I think things have really started to turn in the wrong direction, I would say 2014, when we lost the U.S. Senate seat that was held by Tom Harkin after he retired in 2014, and Bruce Braley ran and then narrowly lost to now Senator Joni Ernst in that seat. Because having somebody who can lead the Iowa Democratic Party and say, this is what it means to be an Iowa Democrat, and have the ability to help lead our state party and marshal resources and kind of chart a course is really important. And I don't believe in the importance of charting courses just because I'm an Eagle Scout, right? I think, scripture tells us, right, where there's no vision, the people perish. And that's something that I genuinely believe. And I think you need strong leaders who can articulate that positive vision for the future of our state.
Let me interject here. I 100% agree with you. What would you say was the difference in leadership style between someone like a Senator Harkin and then someone like a Governor Vilsack, who for a long time was the top ranked Democrat, in the state? He was the top dog. What would you say really sets their leadership approaches apart?
Well, I think so. The Toms, kind of served concurrently or together for many years. The difference in their approach, is relatively marginal. I mean, there were differences for sure, but I think that the core function that they both were able to do in those leadership roles was to help Iowa Democrats coalesce around a vision of our party that brought together people from working class parts of the state. I'm thinking especially about factory towns up and down the Mississippi River, along with people in rural parts of the state who understood that they had somebody who was looking out for them. And then obviously had a lot of support from people who lived in more urban communities like Cedar Rapids, where you were living when we first met, or in Johnson County, where I both grew up and now represent in the Iowa Senate. I think one of the challenges that happens when you don't have leadership or you have a vacuum of leadership is that there are a lot of people who are jockeying to be the leader and who want to take things in lots of different ways. And so you get people rowing in different directions. Mm-hmm. And when that happens and you don't have a shared vision or a shared direction, it means that you're competing over resources. It means that you're competing over attention, right? So I'll give you an example, right? When reporters are looking to write a story and they want to cover, for example, the effect of the Republican budget on the state government, the people who they're going to call first are the people who are in federal office. If all of those people are Republican, they're getting all the attention, right? There's only so many different people that you can call on the Democratic side. If you had a Democratic senator who could be the go-to person for the Democratic message, now you've got a little bit more focus on what the message is that you're trying to communicate. There's an old Will Rogers line. I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And I certainly came to appreciate the salience of that quote when I took over as the Senate Minority Leader in November 2020. I spent a lot of time during those 2.5 years trying to prove Will Rogers wrong. Ultimately, I can't say that I was fully successful in that endeavor, but along the way, learned a lot about, both of the kind of the internal kind of inner workings of the state party, how like a legislative caucus is led. I think developed my own or refined, I'd say, my own views on, I think, what it's going to take for Iowa Democrats to win again statewide, because it's not going to be easy.
It seems like what you're describing, or at least part of what you're describing, is a more centralized party with more message discipline, where folks aren't rowing in different directions. There's a unifying vision, which to some skeptics may sound idyllic. And if you look at the national party, if you zoom out a bit and you look at the national party, there are many voices, well-respected voices, highly visible voices, and perhaps, not perhaps, but the most popular politicians in the Democratic Party right now, whose vision seemingly does not necessarily align with the forces, if you will, that run and operate the DNC. So I'm talking specifically about people like Bernie, people like AOC, who are offering what feels to many like a different vision for the Democratic Party than what Chuck Schumer may be offering. I agree on the one hand that a unifying vision is important, but I also agree that if it's not working, if the methodology if we're not being successful, then we ought to maybe go towards some of those personalities that are rowing in a different direction. I would just love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a great parallel, right? So typically when your party controls the presidency, that person is the party leader, and there's no doubt about it, right? The president of the United States, for example, does not actually pick who. So, for example, Barack Obama does not get to, by nature of being president, does not get to pick who the chair of the Democratic National Committee is. But by virtue of being recognized within the party as the party leader, whoever he wants to be the leader of the Democratic National Committee typically, right, is going to get that.
Right.
It was the exact same thing, by the way, with changing the presidential primary, it wasn't that Joe Biden, by virtue of being president of the United States, gets a magical wand that allows him to pick the order of the calendar, but because he's the president and widely seen as the leader of the party, when he writes a letter to the Rules and Bylaws Committee of the DNC saying, hey, I really think that South Carolina should go first, well, by God, South Carolina goes first, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of this kind of informal influence that comes with leadership, and that's kind of the nature of leadership if it's being done correctly. One of the realities of the Democratic Party is that there is no clear leader of the Democratic Party at the national level. And so you have the exact phenomenon that I was describing a minute ago, where you have a lot of different power centers, and whether that's, Bernie Sanders and AOC, Chuck Schumer, Leader Jeffries, the new chair of the DNC, Ken, who's, you got a bunch of different power centers spread out all over the country and all over Washington, D.C., who are in some respects jockeying for exposure to media, resources, different factions within the party, right? That is, in fact, exactly part of, I think, the frustration that so many, base Democratic voters feel, is that, like, rather than having a clear direction of where we're going as a party, there's like this inter-party kind of fighting, right? And I would say that within the state party here in Iowa, again, until you elect a Democratic governor or Democratic U.S. senator who people can say, yeah, that guy or that woman is leading our party, and if they say this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do it, I think you're going to continue to have some of that similar parallel sense here with the grassroots of people being frustrated. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate the leadership of, for example, Leader Janice Weiner on the Senate side, or now the newly elected leader over on the House side, Brian Meyer, both of whom I think are very capable leaders and who are doing good, in Janice's case, good work for the caucus in her first year. Brian was only elected leader like 2 weeks ago, so he's just getting his feet underneath him, but I'm confident that he's going to do a great job for his members. But I think that until you have somebody who's clearly leading, there's going to be that feeling of like, what direction are we headed in? So where are we going?
So then is it the case that if we don't control the White House or we don't control the governorship of a state, we can expect chaos? We can expect, the Democrats not to have a unified vision because these power structures are competing for who's right. So I don't know if you would agree with that. I'll give you a chance to comment on it. And if it isn't the case, then is there value? And I'll tip my hand here. You're probably going to guess this. I think what AOC and Bernie are doing is right and needed, because I don't think that the Democratic Party right now at a national level is operating at its best and highest use, is necessarily growing the tent, is winning, the narrative wars, is mobilizing voters in the way that more progressive voices have been able to do. So I've asked a long, convoluted question, but
no, Stacey, it's a great question.
But what I'm trying to get to is there a time and place for voices that diverge from where the more institutional voices are saying we ought to go?
Oh, absolutely. And to be clear, that is the moment in which we find ourselves, right? And it was a very similar moment in some respects, I think, after the 2004 election, when President Bush won re-election and, had a second term in the White House. And there was this question of like, who's going to lead the party, right? We just tried nominating this war hero in John Kerry, and he came up a little short. There was this big question about, where's the party going to go? There was this young, talented outsider from Illinois named Barack Obama, who had this incredible American dream story, and who ultimately obviously became our nominee in 2008, and the rest is history. But during that time,
you had figures like Harry Reid and you had Nancy Pelosi, who I think were largely viewed as leaders in the party, and who wielded a lot of influence.
Well, and to be clear, Leader Jeffries and Leader Schumer both wield a lot of influence in the party today. But again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that parallel to what's happening at the national level to what's happening in Iowa is that in the absence of a clear leader who everyone's like, oh yeah, that person's leading the party, you're going to have this really natural state of a little bit of chaos. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because when you have essentially competition, right, of different people competing for leadership, and that's also where like new ideas comes from, is that competition and that process. And so to be clear, I'm not saying that that things are always bad when you're having this kind of dynamic, but it does mean that there is, I think, just some questions about like what is the future going to look like.
So a lot of what we do here is talk about power, and we typically do so through a national lens. So we are concerned about what the DNC is doing, what they're not doing. We are concerned about what our federally elected officials are doing. I don't want to be coy here. I know that a lot of folks in the state of Iowa want you to seek a higher office, and you're a smart guy. You've studied at leading institutions. You understand politics at the federal level. Give me your assessment on what kind of elected leader would be best for Iowa, and what do our Democrats collectively nationally need to be doing to move the Democratic Party forward in these modern times?
In terms of what it's going to take to get us back on track, I think a big part of it is presenting a new vision for the state. In my 7 years that I've been in the state legislature, Republicans have passed one of the most radically conservative policy agendas of any state in the country. And you're seeing this play out in a bunch of different ways. Just a few years ago, Republicans passed a sweeping private school voucher system that this year is going to cost Iowa taxpayers over $300 million to subsidize some of the very wealthiest people in our state to send their children to private schools with no restrictions on income for eligibility for these vouchers. A few years ago, Republicans passed a sweeping 6-week abortion ban that is one of the most extreme anywhere in the country. And this year, even though Iowa's unemployment rate is under 4%, Republicans have passed such large tax cuts for the ultra rich and wealthy in our state that even though unemployment is under 4%, Republicans this year passed a state budget that has a $900 million deficit, even though the state budget itself is only $9.5 billion. So essentially a 10% deficit budget for the state of Iowa in a year when Iowa's economy is ranked 49th out of 50 in the country. It is not growing, and things certainly from an employment perspective are okay, but from a growth and personal income perspective are not in a very good spot. Things could get very much worse very quickly, and they've basically started borrowing huge amounts of money from the taxpayer relief fund to pay for these tax cuts for the rich, these private school vouchers. So needless to say, I think that there's a very stark choice for voters to make in 2026 between the way that Republicans have been leading the state for 8 years here. They took the trifecta, so control of both the state house and the state senate, as well as the governor's mansion in the 2016 election when they finally retook the state senate. And they have, like I said, passed this very radically conservative vision. The upshot of that is that Governor Reynolds has one of the lowest popularity ratings in the country. And so I think that's a big part of her decision not to seek re-election. At the federal level, Iowans are getting screwed. These higher prices, whether it's at the grocery store, childcare. My wife and I have a 1-year-old, and we're paying through the nose for our childcare. It's almost as much as our mortgage right now. The doctor's office, trying to pay for prescription drugs or even other basic healthcare services. People are feeling the squeeze, no doubt about it. And the Republican budget that is currently making its way through Congress, unfortunately, is going to make most of those challenges much worse rather than better. There's going to be a huge tax giveaway to wealthy and large corporations. There are going to be sweeping cuts to Medicaid that threaten healthcare for hundreds of thousands of Iowa families. Kaiser Family Foundation estimates that 86,000 Iowans are going to lose their healthcare coverage. There are real challenges that Iowans are currently facing, and currently Republicans in Washington are advancing a policy agenda that will make those problems worse, not better.
This is all very bad. We know this is very bad. We've tried to communicate this to Iowans, and we've tried to communicate this nationally, and we've been unsuccessful. So how do we get better at communicating the harms that will be done to Iowans, to our fellow countrymen, um, by following Republicans down this hole? What do we need to do differently? What do we need to do better so that we have a shot at being successful electorally?
Well, I'll tell you one of the things that I think is the reason why Rob Sand won re-election in 2022, which was a difficult year for Democrats. We lost the governor's race by about 20 points. We narrowly lost control of the state attorney general's office and state treasurer, which were offices that had been held by Democrats for many, many, many years. One of the things that Rob made a priority, and I will also make a priority, is really trying to meet Iowans where they are. We talk a lot about the 99 county tours and doing, the full Grassley. There's a reason why Senator Grassley is the longest tenured member of the U.S. Senate. I think Iowans really expect to have the opportunity to hear from their elected officials in their own communities and to have elected candidates meet them where they are. That was something that I really prioritized when I ran for the state Senate in 2018. When I was first elected, my district stretched and included Johnson County, where I live, over to Cedar County to the east and south down to Muscatine County. So it was a pretty large geographic area. And both Cedar and Muscatine County are pivot counties. So they voted for Barack Obama twice in 2008 and 2012, and then pivoted to supporting Donald Trump in 2016, and then again in 2020 and 2024. And I spent a lot of time in those small towns, knocked doors in every community that I was seeking to represent, and really tried to literally meet voters at their doorstep, to spend time in those communities on Main Street, visit businesses, go to the local bar or family restaurant, go to the bowling alley if they had one, and just chat with folks and ask what they thought about what was happening in our politics and in our state government. And so I think it is that level of grassroots campaigning that delivered Iowa Democrats a lot of success when our party was. So Iowa for many, many years was a very Republican state until Harold Hughes and John Culver really helped rebuild the Iowa Democratic Party in the middle part of the 20th century. And it was through, if you go back and you read about those campaigns, it was the same kind of stuff of literally going out, getting organized, meeting people where they are.
Walking across the state, right?
Walking across the state. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of things that voters appreciated and were looking for. And I think one of the other challenges that we have is that, the Democratic Party's oldest and most important partner is organized labor, going back to the New Deal, workers' rights and civil rights really going hand in hand. As you have seen these sustained attacks on organized labor, that has unfortunately, I think, reduced, although certainly not eliminated, the ability of organized labor to make a difference politically, whereas Republicans have a host of organizations who they work with to advance their agenda. And so I do think that those labor relationships and labor organizing continues to be a very important partnership for the Democratic Party, and making sure that we are, again, meeting voters where they are, and that we are really taking seriously the work of organizing. I can't tell you how impressed I was this last year in 2024 and 2023. I had the opportunity after I stepped down as the Senate Democratic leader. I decided to get back to my roots and work hand in hand with the Johnson County Democrats to launch what we called our No Off Years campaign in 2023, which was really focused on a listening tour, engaging folks who might feel like they were left out of the political process, listening to their concerns, asking them what they cared about, rather than showing up and saying, hey, I'm from the Democratic Party and we're asking for your vote. Start by asking them what they care about. We had this listening tour all over the county, not just in Iowa City, but in Lone Tree, in Swisher, in Solon, in Coralville, where I live, and certainly in North Liberty. We had an enormous amount of success because when we went back to talk to those same voters in 2024 on the so-called on year, folks were like, oh yeah, like I remember, like you were here and you asked, you want to know what I'm talking about? Here's an update on the issue that, you told us you cared about. And now we're asking for your vote. And that was why Christina Bohannon quite nearly beat Marionette Miller Meeks in 2024. She came up just about 850 votes short. And I'm certainly optimistic that we're going to be able to win that congressional race in 2026.
Deep organizing, relational organizing, not just when you need people to vote for you, but all the time, because problems, don't just rear their heads for people in election years. So I love that. Necessarily, you won't be able to, knock every single door in the state of Iowa if you're running.
I would love to be able to, but unfortunately,
for a federal campaign. So you're going to have to do a lot of your messaging on the airwaves, digitally, online. You are a Democrat from Johnson County. And for folks who don't know about Johnson County in Iowa, it's often referred to as the People's Republic of Johnson County, insinuating or at least highlighting its relatively progressive nature relative to the rest of the state, I would say. So you're going to have to message, you're going to have to reach rural voters, you're going to have to reach people in urban centers in the state, you're going to have to reach people living in those counties that flipped, that voted for Barack Obama twice and have voted for Donald Trump. So what does that messaging look like? And I'm asking this question with the hopes that there are learnings for the National Party, who I think is finally understanding that there doesn't need to be a tension between what progressives in the party are talking about and then what everybody else is talking about. So how do you message trying to reach as many people as you can while retaining some level of conviction about your core values and helping people understand what they may characterize as a progressive value and try to put that at odds with a democratic value? How are you going to do that? And what lessons can we take from that and apply nationally?
I mean, again, the thing that I'm going to come back to is you have to meet people where they are. I think that unfortunately there is a tendency sometimes in the Democratic Party, and it doesn't matter if you're in Johnson County or in any other part of the state, or frankly in any other state in the country, to think that, I know best and I have all the answers and we're the smartest ones, and so you should just listen to me. And that is not how politics works. And I frankly can't stand that mentality in our party. It drives me crazy. And it's something that when I was the leader of our caucus, I really tried to emphasize is like, we have to meet voters where they are, and we have to understand why they are voting the way they are before we can possibly hope or expect to win their vote back. And what I'm hearing from people today is that there is this overwhelming frustration with how the economy has seen prices go up. Wages have not kept up with the increased costs that people are seeing. And again, whether it's at the grocery store, childcare, education, doctor's office, prescription drugs, there are all of these areas where there are real changes that have happened in our economy that have left people feeling like it is harder and harder and harder to make the American dream a reality. And that is something that I think should concern every single elected official. It doesn't matter if you are a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a progressive. All of us should feel very stressed and uncomfortable with the fact that so many of our fellow Americans feel like that American dream is further and further away, because the American dream is our birthright. That is part of what it means to be an American, is that you have that opportunity, if you work hard and play by the rules, to earn a decent living, retire with security and dignity, and to know that you can take care of your family and give your kids better opportunities than the ones that you had growing up. And I think that when you have people in the party who are saying that, people are voting against their interests and they're genuinely, they are looking down on voters. That is exactly the mentality that so many of the people who used to vote for Democrats are having a viscerally negative response to. And they say, I don't want anything to do with the party that is looking down on me and judging me for, different, concerns or anxieties, right, that they have. And I think that when you are talking about what is it going to take to get back out there and to win some of these voters back, it genuinely is going to mean more than just going in and meeting with the local Democratic Central Committee, taking a couple questions, then leaving for the next thing. You have to spend time in these communities. And for me, living in Eastern Iowa, I feel fortunate that I live in relatively close proximity to the counties that we have seen flip from supporting Democrats to now supporting Republicans. And so it's going to take real time. And again, it takes courage, Stacey. Like, it is not always the most fun experience to walk into a room knowing that you might be the only Democrat in that room. But one thing that I will tell you is that having served in the state Senate for the last 7 years, I always walk into that room knowing that I'm in the minority because there's a supermajority of Republicans in the Iowa State Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have developed a lot of courage in trying to, figure out how do you have a discussion about political topics with people who disagree with you, and where can you find common ground.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I've really sought to do as a state legislator, is to build relationships across the aisle so that when we have areas where we agree, we can work together. But when we disagree, to stand for our values and explain why we believe what we believe. And fundamentally, I think that is what people are looking for in their elected leaders. I think it's one of the reasons why people like Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez are so popular, is that people know where they stand on issues. And I think you could look at a very different part of the party and look at somebody like Governor Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who I don't think anyone would mistake for a Republican. He's a Democrat. But his whole point is that if you tell people what you believe and why, even if they disagree with you, they will respect that you were honest with them. And that is exactly what our party has to do. A big part of what I'm thinking about is the fact that Joni Ernst, when she was first elected in 2014, her whole thing was she wanted to go to Washington and make them squeal, right? Mm-hmm. That was her whole pitch. And even though I didn't vote for her in 2014, I think most Iowans probably wanted her to succeed, right? I mean, people were frustrated with the status quo in D.C. And now, 12 years later, I think it's very clear that Joni Ernst did not change Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has changed Joni Ernst. And she is no longer the person who's going to stand up for Iowa, regardless who's president, right? I think the core thing that we need to make sure that people understand is that even though you may not agree with Zach Wahls or Rob Sand or Iowa Democrats on every issue, we are always going to put the people of Iowa first. And you can trust that even though you may not agree with us in everything, we're trying to do what's right by Iowa. But until we rebuild that trust as a party, there's no way that we're going to have a chance to rebuild political power in Iowa.
I love what you said about people will respect, the honesty, fairness, being straightforward with them. I found that to be true in my own career as a politician who held very progressive views, getting elected in a Democratic district, but one that certainly wasn't as progressive as I was. And I have found over and over again, when you have a willingness to talk to people and not down to them about what it is you believe, you typically get better outcomes, and you may even pick up some supporters.
Stacey, can I say one super brief point on that? When I was in the thick of the marriage equality work back in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and the Scouts for Equality work, which was happening concurrently, one of the things that I learned from one of my mentors during that time was being very clear that the vast, 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 vast majority of people are either friends or future friends. And if you write people off and you consider them your enemy, right, that's not going to get you anywhere. And in fact, it's probably going to take you to somewhere you don't want to go. And so you have to, so we approached all of the work that we did around marriage equality and the Scouts, and the work that I try to do as an elected official, being very clear-eyed that every voter out there is either a friend or a future friend. And that is the ethos that we need to bring to this work.
We talk about how Democrats lose a lot of voters when they look down, talk down, they castigate because we don't know all of the latest politically correct terms to use, and you can make people feel like an outgroup, and that's certainly not what you want to do when you're trying to win votes and win elections. I would say on the other side of the aisle, the Republican Party is running a total scheme on their base. Their base is not, millionaires and billionaires. That is not the majority of people who vote for Republicans, although millionaires and billionaires do very, very well. This budget bill that's matriculating through Congress is an example. I don't think they're being honest with voters about what it is they intend to do. I think people like Joni Ernst know exactly what Republicans are trying to do, but they sell a different brand of themselves to voters. And I want to go a step further, because I think part of the fervor for the Republican Party in the last 8 to 12 years has been due to a resurfacing of racial animus that gets coded in certain words that is referenced in ways that political scholars will call a dog whistle. So it's a way of evoking feelings, and typically racial feelings, without coming right out and saying we don't want brown people coming to this country, but white people from South Africa are okay. So how do you speak to that phenomenon? It is very clear to me as a person of color that a lot of things that the Republican Party is saying are racially coded, and that a lot of leaders in the Republican Party don't view me on equal footing that they may view a white person. And I think for whatever reason, that sort of soft racism, if you will, the white supremacy that we are all, I think, a little too timid to call out as often as we should, that has become attractive to people, whether they want to admit it or not. And I just would like your analysis on this phenomenon.
Well, so I think the core thing to understand is this is not a new thing within the Republican Party. The Southern strategy was coined by Lee Atwater a long time ago, well before either of us was born. But the Democratic Party had enormous success across the country, winning votes from people not just throughout the South, but across the industrial Midwest, throughout the Great Plains for many decades since they began that strategy. I agree that the use of racially coded and sometimes not coded at all language, if you spend any time on X these days, the amount of stuff you see on there is pretty shocking. I do think a significant part of Donald Trump's success in 2016 was the continued aftershocks of a economic cataclysm in 2007, 2008, and 2009 that we now call the Great Recession, that sent ripple effects throughout our entire country, and even the ongoing change in the American economy, which is the combination of the offshoring of jobs out of the country, some technological change. People point to NAFTA or China getting entered into the WTO. Right, there were real shifts that happened in the American middle class that had really negative effects for white middle class workers, including in Iowa. You look at, people think of Iowa, they think of agriculture, but Iowa for the entire 20th century had very strong manufacturing, especially in eastern Iowa, due to our proximity to the Mississippi River and the ability to get those manufactured products to market. I do think that Donald Trump capitalized on some of the real. We talk about, there's this debate about economic anxiety versus racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reality is that when people have real economic anxiety in their lives, and then someone comes along and says it's their fault, which in Donald Trump kind of came down the golden escalator in 2014, right? Talking about, or 2015, I guess, talking about immigrants and bad trade deals and all of these things that he said were the problem and the cause for why we are where we are. I would say that there are other reasons that are why we are, including the fact that you've seen, millionaires and billionaires get these massive tax giveaways and the steady erosion of a social safety net, and the ladder of economic opportunity has been whittled away, that are more responsible than what Donald Trump was saying. But Donald Trump said there was a problem. And people were like, yeah, there is a problem, right? And so I think that was what people responded to. Obviously, in the last election in 2024, we saw Donald Trump's performance among racial, minority groups improve substantially. And so the Democratic Party, I think, has some very serious soul searching to do about how we engage. I think especially immigrant communities, and in particular, young Black men. I know that you had Chuck Roca on recently talking about Hispanic and outreach to Latinos. And that's obviously got to be another key piece of the equation as well. If we reduce Donald Trump's popularity to the fact that he and people around him have definitely engaged in and trafficked in language that can be considered like racistly, dog whistle coded, what have you, right? If you think that's his only part of his appeal, again, fundamentally the core issue that we as a party need to rebuild trust on is those core economic issues. Because if people feel like they're getting screwed, and you got one party that's saying, no, you're not getting screwed, and the other party saying, yeah, you are getting screwed and it's these guys' fault.
Yep.
They're gonna connect to that latter party.
I think one of and there were many strategic errors that the Biden administration made was that it was trying to convince Americans who were hurting economically that the economy was strong, and they were right intellectually. The stock market was performing quite well. There were other economic indicators that were positive. Certainly, I mean, the American economy recovered bigger, better, and faster than all of our peers post-COVID. But that's not what Americans were feeling. And so if we weren't even diagnosing the problem, we were telling them that there was no problem. We're not calling out the problems when they exist. We are not feeling the pain along with our voters.
And Stacey, I just want to underscore that the Republican budget bill that is currently making its way through Congress is going to take all those problems and make them so much worse, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
This bill is going to add almost $4 trillion to our national debt and deficit. It's going to potentially trigger hundreds of billions of dollars of cut to Medicare. It will trigger hundreds of billions of dollars to Medicaid. It's going to threaten food security for hundreds of thousands of Iowans. It is terrible for Iowa. And it is a shame that all 4 of the Republican U.S. representatives from Iowa voted for it on the House floor. And I strongly hope that both Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst find the courage of their convictions to stand up and say, this bill is wrong for Iowa. We need to start over.
I hope so too, Zach, but I'm not holding my breath. And I think all the more reason we need someone to challenge Joni Ernst and Chuck Grassley if he seeks re-election in a couple of years as well.
Never say never, man.
I know. Let me ask you this before I get to our final questions that I like to ask all of our guests. If it is a case that you're successful, you will be a part of a club that constitutionally is supposed to have a role in checking the executive branch of government.
Theoretically,
I have observed, and people much smarter than me have observed, that the United States is sliding away from democracy and into authoritarianism. How would you approach right-sizing the ship?
Great question. So I think one of the most important parts of that question is the assumption that we like democracy. Now, I do like democracy. I think democracy is very important. But the point of democratic, lowercase d, democratic government, the reason our founders wrote the Constitution the way they did and created our government the way they did, was that they were trying to find the right balance in protecting our constitutional rights, our God-given rights that are protected by the Constitution, and then trying to find opportunities to create and harness a government that could advance the country. And the first try at it, the Articles of Confederation, did not go very well, so they came back and then put together the Constitution. The Constitution has now endured for hundreds and hundreds of years. The core focus, the core goal of our democratic government was to protect our rights, which include, famously the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to go back to the question that we were just on about, like Donald Trump's core appeal in 2016 and 2020 and 2024 is that you have more and more people who feel like our government is not actually responding to the concerns that they have about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and like fundamentally their core economic station, and that their kids have fewer opportunities than they had growing up. It's not just a question of checking the executive branch, but like, is our government actually doing a good job of achieving the core purpose that is laid out in the Constitution, right? And I would say that no, we're not. We're not doing a good enough job. And so when people look at our system of democratic government and they see it not doing what they do, not everybody, but many people will say, well, then what about this kind of government? And that's where you start to see, not just in America, but in countries all over the world, when you see a slide away from democratic values, lowercase d democratic values. And so I think that a huge part of it has to be not just this question of how do we check the executive branch, what are we doing to secure the economic future of this country, investing in the middle class, ensuring that we have a strong safety net and a ladder of economic opportunity for every Iowan and every American. One example of what you just raised, Joni Ernst lack of courage when it comes to the nomination of Pete Hegseth to be the Secretary of Defense was stunning to me.
Joni Ernst, U.S. Senator, but has a background that should have afforded her a little more insight into what's necessary in a Secretary of Defense.
Correct. I mean, Senator Ernst is Lieutenant Colonel Ernst is the first woman to have served in a combat role, to serve in the United States Senate. She's publicly talked about being the survivor of sexual assault. She expressed these initial concerns about Pete Hegseth, specifically related to the fact that there were, these allegations against him, as well as his public views about the role of women in combat roles. And she expressed these concerns, and then there was this backlash from her own party in the White House. And then she ultimately voted to confirm Mr. Hegseth, despite her initial reservations, which we all found out a few short months later when all of the Signalgate stuff broke, were obviously very well founded, right? This is clearly a person who should not be the Secretary of Defense. Every day that he's in that office, I think is a day that is increasing the jeopardy that American soldiers are facing, both here and abroad, and ultimately is a threat to our national security. And so that, to me, is a perfect example, because the Senate plays a key role in the confirmation of the president's nominees for these important positions, where we must do a much better job of holding these nominees to a higher standard. And Senator Ernst, unfortunately, failed that very important test.
What's a belief that you hold that you think most other people might be surprised about or may even disagree with?
One thing that my wife, Chloe, who I have not talked about nearly enough on this podcast, because she's fantastic and a very important part of my life.
I'm a big Chloe fan, if you didn't already know that, by the way.
Yeah, no, I'm well aware. I mean, I don't know if Chloe and I would be together if you and I hadn't gotten that drink in like August of 2014. And you gave me very sage advice, which was to not be afraid of a good thing. One of the things that Chloe and I sometimes talk about is like finding the right role between this understanding of kind of broader structural forces and how they shape our lives, and the capacity of individuals to change their circumstances and to strive and to seek and to find opportunity. One of the things that's very important to me, over my shoulder actually, is a quote from Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, I think, one of the most important books of all time, Meditations, which is this collection, a journal of sorts, of his observations and lessons and values from his time serving as emperor of Rome, the Roman Empire. And Stoic values are, to me, something that I kind of come back to over and over again. And a huge part of that focus is on just focusing on things that you can control. Chloe and I will often kind of, talk about the importance of individual choice and freedom and liberty and autonomy, and sometimes how that interacts with or can be constrained by these kind of broader structural forces in our life. And I think over time, I've certainly developed a better appreciation and understanding of the forces sometimes that are unnamed or are hard to describe that shape our lives. But I have also developed a belief in the importance of individual freedom and liberty and drive and responsibility to pursue those when we can. And I think sometimes those of us who are on the left struggle to connect with people because we overweight on the structural force and underweight on the importance of individual responsibility, which, of course, goes hand in hand with freedom.
Absolutely. What's giving you hope right now, Zach?
The energy that we're seeing from people out there. Here in Iowa, we've had 3 special elections with 20-point over performances, including in your home county of Lane County.
Angelina Ramirez.
Angel Ramirez. I had the chance to go out and knock doors for her, and people were fired up, man. I mean, most people in spring of the off year are not thinking about special elections. And boy, people were fired up when I was out knocking on doors. So I was really excited to hear that, see that, myself. We flipped the Republican-held state Senate seat with a great colleague of mine named Mike Zimmer. Mike's an educator, been an educator his entire adult career, and he's a great state senator. from Eastern Iowa, one of those counties that we need to start doing a better job in if we want to have a better chance of winning statewide. And then another seat in Southeast Iowa where we didn't quite win, but we came very, very close despite people's expectations that it would not be competitive initially. So when you're able to stack those multiple overperformances, one of my kind of mottos in political work is you have to try to stack success. I learned that when I was playing high school football from one of my coaches of, each week you got to stack success, right? And I take the same mentality in politics and campaign work. So when you can stack success like that, that's super exciting for us as a state party, and that's given me a lot of hope right now.
If you could whisper advice to your 19-year-old self, what would you say?
Maybe don't take things so seriously. I've my entire life, and you've known me for a long time, Stacey. I mean, I've always been a pretty serious person, and I couldn't. I think maybe it's part of being an older sibling, and also having a parent who's in a wheelchair at a young age. Like I had to grow up pretty quick. Maybe there's part of it there, but I think that maybe would be something for me of just you don't have to take everything so seriously. You can live a little and loosen up a little bit. Yeah, that's probably the thing I would say to 19-year-old Zach.
Right on.
I might also whisper something like Bitcoin tops out at $100,000 or something,
Right.
But neither here nor there.
Do that for sure. Final question for you. Who do you love the most and why?
My wife, Chloe. She's my best friend and someone who, I feel like I know probably better than anybody else, and who knows me better than anybody else. It's been such a joy over the last 14 months, almost to the day, actually, to become parents together and to be raising our son, Elijah. He's obviously a close second, but I don't know him super well, in part because his vocabulary mostly consists of da and ba, which we think is ball, and sometimes we get a ma every once in a while, but apparently the M sound is harder for babies to make compared to the da and ba sound. So, and then of course my family, my two moms, Jackie and Terry, and my sister Zeb, very, very close with all of them, and very grateful and lucky to have them in my life.
Zach Wahls, we are very grateful to have you and lucky to have you in our lives. Thank you so much for joining our podcast on Dispatch Revolution. So this episode was obviously recorded in the run-up to Zach's announcement. And while I've known Zach for years and wanted to make sure we disclose that at the top for our viewers, we do hope to get all of the candidates in the race for Senate on the show. We want to hear from everyone because we know it will take all of us to change the state of affairs in this country and save our democracy. So I encourage you to keep listening wherever you get your podcasts. Obviously, check us out on Substack, Dispatch Revolution, and support us if you can. Now more than ever, we need to lift up independent progressive voices. And your help, your support allows us to do that. Good night and be encouraged.